and welcome to the Wellbeing Show. I'm your host, Noel Mcdermott, and this evening we're joined by Mikey's iPad, although his actual name is Mikey Marquart, not Mikey iPad. sort of. It's funny, isn't it, how we've become these pieces of technology. Let me see if I can just change your name to. Can I rename you? It does. There we go. I'm going to call you Mikey M.
Nice. Probably should have changed that before we started.
That's okay. I've just noticed it. Welcome back, Mikey. It's
yeah.
great to have you here. Let me just sort of introduce our guests to the sort of scenario. This is a live podcast if you're watching it on the 23rd of February. And it's currently 9 p.m. in the UK, and I think 1 p.m. in the US where you are in California. Is that correct, Mikey?
That's correct.
So if you're listening to it live, you're welcome to join in. My number is +44 7506 319 745. That's +44 7506 319 745. And you can put me a WhatsApp or give me a call and I'll get you to join in. I want to make sure that my do not disturb is off because it seems to switch on for some reason without me. There we go, it's off. So it'd be great for folks to join in, send messages or questions or even make a call and I'll get you on live with Mikey. Mikey, we build you as a musician and someone in recovery. You're broader than that, but I guess that's sort of why I know you and how we know each other.
Sure.
We met. It was literally just before the pandemic really kicked off, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm.
You were here visiting, and a mate said, "Go meet this guy, Mikey. He's a real nice guy." And
I'm so glad I did.
Yeah. It was. So am I. I was bowled over by sort of how much I clicked with you, because I remember we sort of wandering around the middle of London going to music, just having a really good time chatting with you about what was going on. So, but that was literally, when was that? Was the
2 years ago?
3 years ago, because it all really kicked off in, what was it, March 3 years ago, February, March 3 years ago.
Yeah.
And you were in London with your partner, with Jess, and sightseeing and doing stuff, and then you were saying, "Oh, we're coming back. We've got to go back to America." And then we're coming back, and then the coming back never happened for obvious reasons. And I seem to remember at those times that the conversation we had was like a lot of conversation I remember from those times, which was it'd be like, "I'm sure it'll be fine. We've just got to sort some things out, and then we'll fly over at X time." And then it just seemed to get grimmer and darker and more frightening. So
I know.
in that first 8 months, just seemed to go, what? I'm in some weird film, some weird dystopian horror film. And I certainly remember I don't know if you had it as well. You might have done, because you had much more present symptoms of trauma than me, but I was having quite weird disassociation or depersonalization type symptoms. It was like I was experiencing all of this stuff as though it was a film that I was watching, but it was real life, and it was which is a classic sort of trauma symptom, and something that you know about.
I do.
And then we've just sort of stayed in touch, as you do, because somebody invented Zoom, which I'd never heard of before. Like, so that thing emerged, and now we're 3 years on, just about, and coming out of it. So tomorrow in England, the final pieces of restrictive legislation around the virus go. So people no longer have to isolate or test. They can do it if they want. I mean, just like any other illness, you might become ill and decide that you should stay at home with it, and I would encourage you to think about that. But there's no legal requirement anymore, and there's no legal requirement because I met in Spain with my son at the moment, but when I go back to the UK, there's no legal requirement on me to have tests, and I have to be vaccinated and stuff like that. So, but that's where we are now. Where is it you're in California, aren't you? Where is it?
Yeah, in Los Angeles. And so we still have the mask mandates. I think the surrounding counties of Southern California have lifted those.
Right.
You no longer have to wear a mask indoors, but here in LA, you do.
Okay.
So it's even though the COVID, cases are going down and are low, we still have to wear a mask.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And do you think that's the way it is now? You're going to be all right? You lot are just going to carry on coming out of it in the same way? Because we sort of, in England, we've sort of reached, I guess, a medical supported herd immunity, and the cases are going up. We're not too worried because the vaccination rates are so high that people don't get seriously ill. So, for example, I had COVID at the beginning and it was awful. And then I had COVID again in January and it was nothing.
Oh, wow.
That's really just because of the vaccines, and that's what they do. So I've had it twice. The second time I had it, the beginning of this year, it was a few snuffles for a few days, to be honest.
Yeah, that's what I've heard. I mean, we've been fortunate enough not to get it. But I've had family members get it twice, and they've had similar experiences.
Great. Okay. So do you think now the US is just moving out of it in the same way as ours? Will California continue to open up, do you think?
So I hope so. Everything's, is positive on the news, cases are down, they're, lifting restrictions and, and then I heard of a subvariant, to the Omicron, and, they said it shouldn't, have that big of an impact, but we'll see. I'm
not quite sure where they got the Omicron from. I remember at the time when it was first named, a lot of us were laughing, thinking it sounded like some Martian invasion or something. The Omicron's coming, and watch out, it's going to be. But it's sort of making light of what has been. But it does seem to me that generally we're now, I guess, post-pandemic is the way it feels to me, and certainly.
Yeah, and it's the effects of the pandemic for sure. Like I can still feel it. The isolation, the anxiety, the social anxiety I feel. It's really interesting.
Are you happy to talk about that? About sort of what it was like for you?
Yeah.
During that time. So you said.
Absolutely.
It had quite a strong impact upon you?
Yeah, I mean, it's the isolation, the complete change of routine. My recovery routine essentially kind of went out the window. And then it was we were just at the house. We didn't go anywhere.
Yeah.
And, and if we did, have anxiety about being in public, a year ago was really kind of getting violent and kind of aggressive here in LA.
Yeah.
And, a lot of people are afraid and scared, and, you can kind of pick up on that energy.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, one thing that we don't factor in England is the level of violence through guns and stuff like that, because I think that is a thing that you have in the US that we don't have. And it's difficult for us to wrap our heads around it, actually, to be honest. That people have access to weapons and they're not afraid to use them when they're upset and angry, for example. So,
and it's caused a lot of people to be kind of in a desperate position. So it's a lot more brazen of violence.
Right. It's been around people trying to get their needs met, as it were, food and money and things like that.
Yeah, but we had the follow you home robberies. That's what they were calling it. And people, these criminals in Beverly Hills or whatever, would see you in a nice car or see you had a nice Rolex, and they'd follow you back to your house. And then when you pulled up to your house, they came out with guns.
Right.
And robbed you. I mean, it's incredible, the violence.
So that would be quite frightening in terms of I get that. I mean, that's not social anxiety. That's maybe a reasonable fear of the possibility of something happening.
For sure. But the social anxiety piece, like I still feel it today. You get so accustomed to kind of being home and, being a homebody that when you do something social, I get a lot of anxiety about it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. What sort of things do you get anxious about? That something bad is going to happen, or are you just going to make a fool of yourself, or just a general sense of fear around people?
It's just like we're in kind of a new neighborhood, so it's that kind of that insecurity of wanting to be accepted, wanting to be liked, and having not have been in a lot of social situations in the past couple of years, it's all that stuff seems to be a little more exaggerated.
Yeah, I absolutely. Anxiety and depression definitely are two things that have risen really quite significantly during these past few years. And not necessarily dropped off, yes, we said. I mean, I think it sort of, we were thinking that maybe it was going to be a bit like a bell curve, you have a peak and then it drops off. But it's probably more useful to think about it that if you think like most people will exist on a spectrum, and somewhere along till this point, and if you're only listening to the audio version of this, I'll try and describe what I'm doing. I'm opening my hands, and there's an imaginary point at which beyond it, you're not well. And sort of if those are the points at which you're well, and then those are the points at which some people are ill, this block of people that have been well, some of them close to the point of becoming ill, has all shifted over towards the illness line.
Yeah.
Those that were close to the line have been pushed over it. Those that were already over the line have gone further.
Yeah.
And then paradoxically, or the opposite thing has happened. There were some people who were sort of in the middle in terms of their health, but they noticed danger signals and they went all the way over to the other side and become hyper healthy and hyper thoughtful about their health. And that usual sort of mix of people in the middle has sort of thinned out a little bit, as it were. So quite a significant portion. Where would you say you've gone in terms of that, do you think?
So definitely kind of when the pandemic started, and the routine kind of went out, I started to move over to the unwell border. And then the longer I stayed without the routine, the more isolated I became, and I was also expecting a son soon, and which was an incredibly beautiful thing, but I had a lot of anxieties and worries about being a new dad, and and I relapsed, and it was as bad as it was it was the greatest thing that could have happened because of the place that I'm in now.
Are you okay talking about it, Mikey? Because I know that you also do still carry quite a lot of PTSD, and
I do.
And so this is true of everybody, and people who are listening as well. There should never be an expectation, I think, that somebody who carries PTSD and trauma should ever be asked automatically just to reveal it, because it can be really counterproductive just talking about it in unsafe ways. And so we do need to be thoughtful and careful, and there's no sense in which this isn't was it Jeremy Kyle was your sort of guy in America who did one of those television programs, or was that the British guy? I think it was the British guy that copied some American TV programs where you get people to inappropriately expose their vulnerabilities. And
interesting.
Yeah, sort of, it's not here, it's not what we're trying to do here. We're trying to do things in a safe and sensitive way. So just want to check in with you that you're comfortable talking about a relapse and what it was like. And so when did you, I guess, can you trace back a little bit to sort of when you began to shift towards that unhealthy sort of line, and what sort of behaviours were starting to emerge on reflection that made you think now, oh, that was an indication?
I'm a drug addict and an alcoholic. This last time, it wasn't necessarily the alcohol I was drawn to, but it was the drugs, the prescription pills, and the uppers, downers, whatever. But I think that, it was a pretty slow progression, but as it came down to the end, it got really, really fast.
Right.
I was, we were all kind of quarantining in COVID, and, a lot of my traumas and insecurities, and what I didn't necessarily realize in the moment was that my codependency was also linked to my trauma. And these things gradually kind of got activated, in this process, and my desire to escape that reality got stronger. And then on top of that, I was going to become a dad, and that point in my life, I was like, I can't even take care of myself. It's, how am I going to take care of a child? And then that anxiety on top of that. And, it just kind of fueled that desire to not have to think about those things.
Right.
Yeah.
And this is, I guess it's largely the psychology of it, because actually you can meet your needs.
Yeah.
There's no concerns about that, on a practical level. So it's very much about the sort of baggage that you were carrying. Isolation, of course, is a big issue in terms of recovery. And in terms of using and addiction. So isolation is often a preeminent feature of people who are using heavily or drinking heavily. And was it a feature of yours because I guess, when did you start your addiction career, would you say? What sort of age did you?
It was probably sophomore in college.
Right.
Yeah. And then my recovery process into getting sober has been about a decade.
Right. And have you been one of those people that, some people just sort of they skip the like, fantastic, they're fine, they never look back. But I guess that's not been your story. It's been sort of coming and going, and has involved. How many relapses do you think it's maybe?
It's almost like I can't even count that high. It's unfortunate. Relapse is part of my story. But I kind of attribute a lot of it.
Take that word unfortunate out, if you don't mind, because it seems a bit unkind to you.
Yeah.
It's just part of, it's very much part of it. My view is this, I genuinely mean this, that there's something really quite extraordinary and courageous about people who are willing to come back. I'm glad people do come back, because not everybody does from a relapse. And one of the things that stops people from coming back is they can tell themselves that they're bad because they've relapsed, or tell themselves they're bad because they're
associated.
And it's really inappropriate that the fact that people have the courage to come back, and the fact that somebody has the courage to open their mouth and talk about that, extraordinary, to be honest.
I agree with you. That's definitely a better way to look at it than, it being a negative thing. Because I agree with you,
and sort of there's something very generous, I think, about somebody who has a relapse history, is willing to share honestly about it, and encourage other people who may be moving towards that unhealthy line and are not opening their mouth and not asking for help. It might encourage them to sort of just go, okay, I heard this guy talk about how vulnerable he is around this stuff, and I get it, that's how I am. Maybe I can ask for help. So I think it's really important for you as a person, I'm not telling you off as a person, but I think as a person to be more compassionate to yourself, but also in terms of people who might be listening, to understand that we don't shoot our wounded.
Absolutely.
Do you know the
For sure.
saying?
Yeah.
We might shoot ourselves. I often, see that we'll be unkind. I think there's there's an old saying, isn't it, that if I talk to a friend in the way I talk to myself, I'd very quickly lose that friend.
Yeah.
And so learning how to talk to myself as though I was a really good friend to me is a really useful skill, which is what we're going to do. You have sort of in terms of a lot of people who develop addiction, there are understandable pathways in.
Yes.
And there's some really clear and understandable pathways in for you. And in terms of your relapse history, I think one of the interesting features of it for me is the sort of lack of treatment around the trauma, which I think is a very powerful story that you have to tell. Do you mind if we go into that a little bit, Mikey?
Not at all. I mean, because I completely agree that, all my relapses, over the past 10 years, are completely related to the fact, that I didn't necessarily start my trauma recovery work until, a couple of years ago. And, in this last time, I still had work to do.
Okay. Well, can we go back a little bit in time? Yeah. We haven't talked, we're talking about the recovery and the relapse stuff, and it's just the way the conversation's going. What we haven't talked is your amazing experiences around the music industry and the music that you do, and how it is intergenerational as well, and your father and you, and there's a real sort of passing on of sort of skills there. So we will come back to that, but let's just stay with where we are. So you first came into recovery, what, just over a decade ago, a little bit more than that?
Yes. Somewhere maybe a little bit more than a decade ago.
And I guess, given that it was the US, you were sent to a pretty standard sort of Minnesota model type place, which suggested that.
No. Yeah, I eventually went to those places.
Right.
I've been to 5 in total. The first one was, it was great. I was still in college at the point, and I was in a fraternity, and didn't necessarily want to be sober.
Yeah. And what was the experience like? Can you remember at that time?
It was actually pretty incredible, because it was one of the first times that I actually felt good. They put me on some prescription medication, and at that point I didn't even know that I was suffering from PTSD. So I just thought all this anxiety, all this depression, the disassociation was essentially kind of that's normal. And for the first time, I actually kind of felt so.
We're not intending to criticize these people, because I think it's more about how the field has changed over the years and our insight understanding. So at that point, did they question any of those things? Your assessment, were they going, have you had these types of experiences which might indicate sort of trauma functioning in some way?
Yeah, no, it's, I think if I was in a different place, I hadn't even had therapy up to that point on my own. So I wasn't, and I was so kind of, I'm trying to guarded, kind of wasn't necessarily willing to share, honestly. I think if I was, my story would definitely be different, but it's definitely the progression of, the opening up and kind of realizing all these things that are essentially going on at the same time.
And so thinking back, do you feel that if you had been open with them about what was going on, that would they have treated you differently, given you different types of treatments that would have changed your course? Well, we can't know these things, but it's interesting. I think I'm just pondering about people who are listening, who are maybe thinking, should I get help, and how should I get help? Do you think it would have been different, or?
I think for me and the type of trauma, it's all trauma is, it affects us differently, but I needed to go to a trauma specific rehab.
Right.
Maybe, you know, the other places that I've been to would have made a huge difference if I was, you know, kind of more in tune with my body and my honesty. You know, it's kind of hard to say.
Yeah. My experience is this, that often people don't understand what it is that they've got until they do some education around it.
Yeah.
That
Absolutely.
actually you just have to usually sit down, like particularly with younger people. When I'm working with young people, I'm often explaining things to them and saying, what do you think? Does that feel like what is going on for you? And I'm often explaining symptoms that might be associated with trauma, or symptoms that might be associated with depression, or symptoms that might be associated with suicidality and so on. Because people don't really necessarily know what those things look like. What they know is that they feel rubbish.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I was the same way. And, you know, and the beginning times I was so disconnected from my emotions and my feelings. You know, that was how I coped with what I was going through.
Right.
You know, and it took a long time for me to like actually, you know, I guess have a little bit of awareness to kind of be like, oh, okay, that's what that is.
Okay.
Yeah.
So your using was, I suppose, generated by the need to numb out and not feel, because the feelings you're having were pretty rubbish.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And, you know, and part of most of my traumas are, you know, medical based traumas. And I went through a lot of surgeries.
Yeah.
You know, interestingly enough, the hospital actually became somewhat of a safe place for me. And the drugs while I was in the hospital became like a saving grace. And so it's my addiction kind of after that was essentially trying to recreate that safe place with, you know, with the stuff like that. And yeah.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I guess it also, because it sounds like quite a complicated attachment issue in terms of here you are going to these medical institutions which are causing the trauma, but also you're dependent on them and you form an emotional relationship of safety and compassion. And then you go to other institutions where there's equally, if not medical people, there are qualified people who are making assessments and offering treatments. And I'm guessing that must have been quite a complicated experience for you to sort of.
For sure. You know, that's kind of revelation has happened recently, you know, where I've kind of noticed that.
It's almost like it reminds me of similar sort of situations to people who've been tortured. And I don't think your experiences were as extreme as torture, but it's that thing where often in those situations professionals are involved, you know, because they're more effective in terms of breaking people, etc. And then trying to get help afterwards for that victim is often complicated and difficult because of the anxieties and fears about the professionals who are supposed to help.
Yeah.
Because there were professionals involved in the damage.
Yeah.
And then trying to figure out how to. So it's quite a complex thing. So you get to this first one and you're sort of very much the jock or whatever it is that you're saying. You don't really open up. You're taciturn. But paradoxically also you say you felt the best you'd ever felt. Do you know why that was? Is it because you weren't using, or?
Can you repeat the question, Noel?
In your first sort of rehab experience, that you were still quite shut down and closed.
Yeah.
You didn't want to, I mean, I get it, you didn't want to think about sobriety. Why would you at that age? That makes sense. But also, I think you said that it was also you felt the best you'd ever felt while you were there. Do you know why that was, that you felt that good? What was going on?
You know, I think it's a couple things. You know, it got me out of that kind of insanity cycle of
Right.
going on a binge and being hungover, and and kind of all of that. And so I kind of was able to, I had a healthy kind of routine going on, but they also put me on, a psychiatric drug, which, I'd never been on before because I didn't know I was depressed or anxious.
Okay. Right.
Yeah.
So you began to get the help that
Yeah.
you needed. And then you have a period of, I suppose, a period of sobriety and then a relapse, and this is going to be your pattern, and you go from and one institution to another. Is that the story? Is that how it evolved for you?
Yeah. I think my relapse was pretty quick after that first one. They were advising me more treatment, and I, declined that against medical advice, and I wanted to go back to college.
Yeah.
And so obviously I wasn't going to survive long being in a fraternity house. But my sister
They're
actually,
not known for sobriety in fraternity houses.
not.
I think you need to be quite sort of strong-minded to be sober in one of those environments on the whole.
It would be one of the hardest. I think it would be almost impossible.
Sure. I mean, I think there are some colleges that offer sober type environments, but again, they're quite in the minority. So, I mean, in some ways, it's almost like going back to the fraternity saying, I'm not going to do what you've told me to do. I'm just going to carry on.
Yeah, I mean, I had gotten through a lot of the hospitalizations and a lot of the, all of those obstacles, on my own, and I thought that could translate, equally to sobriety and recovery, that I could do this on my own.
Okay,
I can get these things, so me asking for help was really never part of the program. Because I, was stubborn enough to think that I could do it all by myself. I can get through this, so I can get through that.
It's an odd one. I mean, I really identify with it because I'm like that as well, oddly enough. And I've had to learn how to not be like that. But the bold fact is this: we can't do anything on our own. Nobody can do anything on their own. We're just not designed that way as social animals. And the myth of the lone wolf is that it's a myth. And what you get with people who refuse or for some constitutional reason can't engage with other humans is you get a very odd person in front of you. Mm-hmm. And there was one of those running your country not long ago. And there's one of those invading the Ukraine at the moment. I mean, you get these really strange people who are bizarre and unpredictable and antisocial and so on and so forth. And they are classically people who, when you look at them and you get to know them, they are not connected to other human beings. They have no insight or capacity to form attachments or have intuition and empathy about other people. And so they live inside their own little fantasy world. But I guess that's also part of what addiction does.
Yep.
I think it creates that isolation, if you like. Yeah? Does that resonate?
It completely
does. Because that's
does.
the only place I think an addict fantasizes. That is the only place where I'm going to be safe. That's the bit I can control just around me.
Mm-hmm.
The way I keep people away are these substances. So you have this first experience, which, you interestingly have an experience of feeling good, but you go back to feeling shit, which is a very familiar story. I mean, you're not unusual in that you made that sort of insane and crazy choice.
For sure.
Yeah, on and off. When would you say was the next milestone in terms of another bit clicking in, as opposed to just another visit to just another rehab? When was the next bit where you think some insight, actual movement happened?
I think after that, that experience, when I went back doing what I was doing, I, kind of saw that, I'm going to have to do more. And my sister was going to Pepperdine out here in LA. And she had a lot of friends that had gotten sober through sober livings. And so I moved out to California and kind of went straight into a sober living and kind of started my recovery journey out here in California.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that's for the UK audience. They don't really know what that is. So tell us what a sober living is.
Sober living, it's essentially kind of like a halfway house. So it's like you go to treatment, and then there's this other facility you go to that incorporates a little bit more freedoms, where they try to teach you, how to essentially kind of live this new lifestyle where we're trying to live, with the support of staff.
Right.
Yeah.
And how did that work for you? Did that help in terms of moving you along?
I think it moved me along because it got me to California where, I got, the greatest amount of help. But in that specific experience, it was not a positive experience.
I'm ambivalent about the whole sober living scene, to be honest.
Mm-hmm.
But I live in the UK, and we have a much more integrated health system which can deal with people living in their own lives. Whereas I think in the US, it's less like that.
Yeah, and it's tough because the recovery industry was such like an emerging market that a lot of people that didn't necessarily have pure intentions, created sober livings, and I worked
Mikey,
one of those, and they just don't care as long as you pay a check at the end of the month, and it was bad.
I imagine that's still going on quite a lot, to be honest.
I'm sure.
People are in it to make money, and that's it. They don't give a shit about anything else.
Yeah.
And California has been pretty notorious about that, to be honest. It's sort of been that, and Florida's another place that has the reputation is shot in many ways in terms of that stuff. So it was more the people you began to meet rather than those particular environments. So what was the next step for you then? What was the next person or organization or idea or thing that happened that gave you some insight into specifically, I guess, that hang on, there's something else going on rather than I'm just unable to stop using. Something is happening, right?
So during that kind of period was essentially the first time I had been without my medicine, aka drugs and alcohol.
Sure.
And all of the PTSD symptoms that I had that I was covering up essentially came out in full force.
Yeah, they bloody well would have done. Yeah.
I was agoraphobic for a long time, and be a month. And but that showed me that, I have other stuff going on that I look at.
Okay, it must have been quite horrific, to be honest.
It was.
I just can't imagine how horrible that was. And without a prior diagnosis, somebody having explained it to you and said, and this is how we help, just doing that, suddenly being exposed to all that stuff would have been really, really, really tough, mate. Absolutely unbelievably hard work. And you must have thought you were going absolutely bonkers at times.
Yeah, it was, I don't really know what was going on. I was feeling a lot of mixed emotions. I had all these kind of PTSD symptoms. And then on the other side of it, I also was like, I had this image of my head of who I thought I was as a person.
Yeah, right.
And you took away my drugs and alcohol. And then I was like, well, who am I? Should I be this guy or should I be that guy? And, and I just remember having this moment, in the sober living, and I was going to post on Twitter or whatever. And I was like, well, who should I be, in this post, and I had no clue who I was.
Yeah. And you're having these symptoms, and then is there somebody who notices this or somebody who helps, or do you start to talk to somebody about it? What's the next sort of movement on, I guess?
I relapsed, of course. And so I kind of started bouncing around to, from sober living to
I'm just
sober living.
like, I'm really sad in this conversation. I don't know if you feel. I feel sad for that Mikey, that the only option you had was to use a course, and sort of nobody was going, there's another option. Shall we try the other option? You were just sort of.
Yeah, I mean, I eventually, you know, found that place that led me kind of more on a direct, you know, direction towards recovery.
I think you're being very kind, and you're being very in recovery by not being annoyed with these so-called professionals who were charging you a lot of money and not noticing that you were in hell and not doing anything about it. I mean, I think you're very kind. I understand why we have to do that, because I'm one of those people, if I develop resentments and let them go and let them grow, as it were, then they become very dangerous for me. So I have to be balanced about things. And particularly because I have to be balanced, because I had very traumatic childhood in terms of abusive parents and stuff like that. And it doesn't help to just hold a grudge about that stuff. We have to find a way of being balanced about it. So that, because the only fight we're having is in our own heads. Sort of like, what damaging is ourselves. So I get it. But for just 1 second, I'm going to be angry for you about that. Somebody wasn't saying, shit, man, there's something going on here, and we need to find out what's going on. And okay, so the next step for you is, that's me being angry for you, all right?
Yeah.
The next is what happens next? How do you?
So, like, I don't know how, you know, how much later, but I had to have surgery again. And, you know, so I was living in a sober living at that point, but I had family that was also kind of living in a town nearby. So I was going to go have the surgery, and then I was going to recover essentially at their house, and, you know, in perfect fashion. You know, they were going to hold on to my painkillers and stuff. And, you know, I'm a, you know, very clever addict, and I knew where they were. And, you know, I pretty much drained the house of all painkillers, and you know, that landed me in Malibu at Passages, which was kind of like the start of my therapeutic process.
Right. So in that place, did somebody go, you know, you've got trauma?
Yeah, I'll never forget it. I was seeing my primary therapist, and it was like our first session, and I had just pretty much just talked about like the worst things imaginable to happen to a human. And he was like, you know, you were just talking for 30 minutes, like, of these awful things, and not a shred of emotion was on your face.
Exactly.
And, you know, like, that kind of blew my mind a little bit. I didn't necessarily understand what he meant, but I was like, well, that's interesting.
That's quite, what a great find.
Yeah.
And pitched perfectly as well. Because it sounds like you pitched it in a way that didn't make you feel stupid or dumb or bad or somehow, but just sort of was able to reflect back to you passion you weren't able to feel for yourself. Which is often the case, I think, with highly traumatized people. It's because we have to find a way of distancing ourselves from how horrific it feels. And, you know, intellectual explanations of something devoid of feeling is a way of protecting ourselves, you know, which is great. And so then you begin that journey of understanding something about what trauma is, what PTSD is, and how it might evolve, and sort of how it might evolve in terms of you. Yeah,
you know, and like actually finding a therapist to talk to, and you know, because before that point I'd never seen a therapist, and the, you know, which a person that has, you know, gone through a lot of trauma in their life, and then they go to try to find a therapist to deal with it, you know, make sure you find a good qualified trauma therapist, because I found the first one that I found actually ended up re-traumatizing me. You know, it's like she wanted to fix me within the first 30 minutes, and, you know, and then left me in these horrible spots. And, you know, ended up relapsing again. But
that's a really important thing to say. And it goes back to what we were talking about at the beginning of the podcast, that we have to be very careful about how we open up these things and whether we open them up or not. There's no expectation that people will talk about trauma in any way at all, because unless it's safe to do so, it will do exactly what you said, which is re-traumatize or certainly open up some of the unpleasant feelings and symptoms associated.
And there's something about trauma and doing trauma therapy is that no matter like how much you try to, get these things out in therapy, if they're not ready to come out, they're not going to. And it's kind of like a frustrating process because you want to completely heal, but it's like it's going to heal on, its terms.
I agree. I mean, neurologically that's supported as well, because what we're talking about is trying to grow aspects of our personality in our frontal lobes, trying to form connections with more primitive aspects of our sort of brain functioning. And these primitive aspects of our brain functioning, the amygdala and the basal ganglia and things like that, are very powerful things. I mean, they have the capacity to shut us down, which is what happens. We get shut down by sort of by trauma. And how long would you say, sort of thinking about that? Because I would say my trauma work, the focused trauma work, took about a decade, to be honest, because it's no way of me doing it all in one go. I could do bits and then I had to go and do life, then I would go and do bits and then I would go do life. But the doing life stuff was as equally important as the bits of sort of focused therapy work. For you, sort of, what's it been like? What's your experience been like in terms of being able to work on this stuff?
I mean, it's been an incredible journey. But the kind of 5 years ago is essentially kind of when it started, and I had a really bad 2-year run kind of right before that. And I had a sponsor, it was kind of like my first sponsor, and and I finally, I did the third step prayer with him, and the next day I woke up and it was the first time I kind of felt relief, like the weight kind of lifted off my shoulders. And so I really got connected to this sponsor, and he was my sponsor for a while. And then he ended up committing suicide. So when that happened, it kind of set me back a little bit, but it actually sent me to a place where it was essentially run by very, professional trauma therapists, which was great. Yeah.
Good. And then you do some more in-depth work and learn more tools and gain more insight and gain more education about your experience. I want to move us a little bit now, because you brought up the issue of codependency, and I want to think about that in context of sponsorship and things like that. And because I identify with the notion of codependency as well, and something that I've worked on a lot. I mean, obviously in codependence, I'm a therapist. Seriously, why else did I train as a therapist if not to sort of prove to the world what a wonderful control angel superstar I am that can hang on any cross in anybody's room. But I think what I learned through therapy was some limits on my rescuing and codependence and sort of control and stuff like that. It's the only place I could do it. Outside of it, it was horrific. But you've recently discovered an attachment between codependency and trauma, which I get. And for me, it makes absolute sense. If you're younger and you're in these hospitals, you're dependent on these people who are also abusing you. They're not.
And with my family as well.
Yeah. And so I get that. Why would codependency form? Because it's the only set of strategies that seem to make sense in that environment.
Yeah, and I had 3 younger sisters, and so my parents were spending a lot of time with me, and I somehow got this tool, figured out that, okay, if when they come to visit, and I'm really happy and everything's going great, regardless of what I was actually going through, then they would go home and not worry about me.
Yes, yes. And that was just another way of you destroying yourself.
Yeah.
Because you weren't saying, oh, I'm really scared, I'm really hurt, I'm really needy, I really hate you for doing this to me, I really hate this situation, which is really what was going on.
Yeah.
And
I
so
got polished in the meantime.
yeah, absolutely. And so we're leading up to your most recent relapse, which is thankfully been a year away now, because you've been clean again for a year. But you discover some of these other aspects of your personality functioning, I guess, which is not about simply numbing out pain. You're beginning to understand something about your other coping and survival strategies that had not been your best friend over the last couple of years.
For sure. And probably the biggest kind of piece of that was the codependency. And, there was this therapist that gave the greatest definition that really resonated with me of codependency. And it's the lack of self-love disorder.
Yes.
And the second he said that, I was like, oh my God, that's me. Because I was a people pleaser. I still am a people pleaser, and all of that stuff, it takes a toll.
And it was taking a toll in an environment, in some ways, that people would have looked at and thought, yes, the lockdown was difficult, but you were just about to be a dad, and that's really exciting and wonderful. And yet it was bringing out these sort of impossible and difficult feelings of, I can't love myself, I can't love my child, I can't love my wife.
And I had those same thoughts, like when I would get a couple years and I'd gone through the steps, like I'd have people say, like, you should sponsor people. And I'd be like, oh, okay, but in the back of my head, I'm like, I don't want to screw anybody up. No one wants to be attached to me. And I kind of had that same feeling for becoming a dad. It's I didn't want to screw him up. And the truth is that, I'm an incredible dad, and, but it's those, inner critics, that voice was just so loud. It was hard to weed through to the truth.
And where are you now in terms of this recovery, your fatherhood, your husbandhood, if that's a word, and those things, and how does it feel, and how are you managing and coping, do you think, with them now?
Yeah, I think I'm in the best place I've ever been. Right. The treatment that I went to, the work that I did when I was there, the work that I did when I came home, on it, like the trauma work with the codependent work, and the anxiety, and and then having my son. It's honestly, it's the first time I've ever wanted to take my health as a priority, and actually, like, okay, I need to go see a doctor about this, like, and I need to make sure that I'm healthy. And I never have had that before. I never valued health, because I just automatically assumed something was going to go sideways anyways, and it's going to wind me back in the hospital. And gratefully today I don't have that.
Yeah. I have no doubt that your son adores you, and for very good reason, because everybody who meets you understands what a sort of great person you are, human.
Oh, thank you.
Very vulnerable and very open and very generous and very kind. It's an interesting story, and I think it's an interesting journey, and one that a lot of people will identify with, and particularly that thing about a crisis may come because of what other people say would be a joyful event, which is to become a parent. Of course, it's always a bit frightening to become a parent, but it doesn't necessarily produce a crisis for people. But it sounds like the crisis has been useful for you, or at least, I mean, I'm not an advocate of crises, but you have made it useful for you.
For sure, and it's, I think being a first-time dad and kind of that whole process leading up to being a father, that fear of the unknown, it's like, it's hard to imagine what being a father is like, and everything that kind of goes with that. And, a big piece of my anxiety is like, I need to figure out what's going to happen so that I can control it. And, and that wasn't, I didn't have that.
I mean, I think the element of the story that's really striking me it's not so much your behavior and things like that, but it's can I give my son love if I can't give it to myself? And that is a really, really vital question to be asking. And that really is all we need to give to kids. We need to feed them and have consistency and boundaries and all those complicated things. But really what we need to be able to do is take some of that in our own heart and put it in theirs so that they genuinely feel it, so that they then can have a good life. And I really, really understand why you were frightened, if you felt you couldn't do that. And of course, it's difficult to do that if we don't love ourselves.
Absolutely.
But maybe it's impossible to do that if we don't. I don't know if it's impossible or not, but it's a challenge if we can't find it within ourselves to love ourselves. To find it within ourselves to love others is a real challenge, I think.
For sure. I mean, and there is that saying that it's, it's hard to give it away if we don't have it ourselves. It's.
So I understand why the crisis happened. It's maybe a gift that your son has given to you to make you really question that and think, well, what is really important here? And it seems to me you've discovered what's really important.
And it lit up areas, that I'd never looked at or, thought I needed to look at. And, and I'm so glad that happened because, I'm in the place I am today. And, I'm able to be there for my son. And it's just a beautiful time.
It's me and my boy, he's downstairs playing with his mate at the moment, but we have this really funny thing we both do where we know we love each other, but we don't know what to do with him. We just there are moments when we just stand looking at each other. And I, like in my head, I'm going, I can't bear how much I adore you. And I can say for him. And it's like, we're just like stuck there. What do we do with this shit? Eventually we turn around, just hug each other awkwardly and then run away because it's just too much. But it's just great. But I really identify with that feeling. I don't think I've ever told this on this show before, and I don't really tell people much about this, but in my 20s, I did think about having myself sterilized because I thought I could only give horror to somebody. And I'm, what a way to think about yourself.
For sure. And I didn't know if like the condition that I was born with was genetic. And I didn't want to pass that on to my son or my daughter, and have them have a similar experience to what I did. So there was some concerns there as well, because we didn't necessarily know a lot of, what was actually going on with me to begin with.
We are, at the end of the hour. It always comes very quickly. What interests me, what intrigues me, what inspires me about you as a person and about your story it's very real, but you keep coming back to trying to work on something and you do the best that you can each time that you come back on work on it. And it's a very common, familiar story. It's one I resonate with and identify with because it's like my own life. It's never been simple with me, really, in that sense. I get slightly annoyed when people say it is really simple. It's not. It's hard work. It's hard work, and you have to graft at it, and you do. You graft at it, sort of, and get there. And I'm so happy for you, and Jess,
thank you,
and Jay, and I can't wait till I actually see you in real life again, which I feel is coming soon. As you know, I'm trying to bring my boy out to California. He wants to come, and so we'll be dropping by to say hi and having a coffee with you and everyone.
Please do. I look forward to it.
Unfortunately, we are at the end of the show. You stay there, Mikey. I want to say goodbye to everybody that's joined us. If people have been affected by the issues, in some ways that's good, but don't sort of hide away. I think preeminently Mikey's story tells us one thing, which is that what I call help-seeking behaviour or not giving up on yourself works. And it may be that you don't get the help the first time, maybe you don't get the help the 10th time, but never give up trying to get that help, because here's Mikey as proof that, you can get the help. You just got to persevere. So lovely to have you all with us, folks. And I'm going to turn the stream